Pastor Mike, when I was being called to preach, that was a tough time in my life. And I remember going to bed crying myself to sleep, confused, waking up crying, spending my day crying. And as I told you this morning, I worked at Chatham Manufacturing Company back in the early 90s, and I was an electrician there, and I worked, what I did was I was a troubleshooter. I wasn't a troublemaker, I was a troubleshooter. And what I would do, I'd go around and try to fix machines that were broken. And, you know, I had a pager on my side, and anybody that needed me, they could call my pager, and then I would be able to go to the job that I needed to go to. But I'll tell you something, I spent out of an 8-hour day probably 4 of them on my face, crying out to God. For 6 months it went like that. No answer. No answer. Had a burning desire in my heart. I had a burning desire in my heart to preach the gospel, but I had a burden I couldn't escape. And it was about to eat me up. And what I was doing was running. And finally one day, December the 25th of 1996 at 8:05 in the p.m., on a 12-by-12 square tile right beside a lady's shower stall, we were having a family get-together that night, as most folks do on Christmas night, and I went into that bathroom, and I knelt down there beside that stall, and I cried out to God. And I said, oh God, I need your peace. I need your assurance that this is what I'm to do. And His peace come, Brother Calvin. It came. I tell you, joy flooded my soul. I had peace that passed all understanding. And I'll be honest with you, I just happened to remember where I was that night. And I just about shouted. So I knew that if I did, people would wonder what in this world was going on and what had happened to me in that bathroom in there. So what I did, I just waved my hand. I said, praise the Lord. Praise God. I couldn't stand it. I was filled with glory and joy because God had given me an assurance. But friend, I'm going to tell you something. I had to spend 6 months on my face before I got that. Many times God doesn't answer right away. It's not always a split thing with God. God's not sporadic. He's not something that we've programmed to just to meet our needs at our every whim and every minute. God has a plan. God worked out a very precious plan in my life. Because during that time, Brother Mike, He taught me how to pray. He taught me how to pray. He taught me what it meant to be persistent. We give up too easy. We feel as though that if God hasn't spoke or if we hadn't got an answer, then, well, God must have just disregarded it and so should I. Well, that's not the way it is. Overcome the barriers of delays. You see, it's not that Jesus didn't hear you. Oh, He heard her. He heard her. And He hears you. He hears you. She not only was determined to receive, but I want you to know she was desperate for results. You see, folks, when we get determined and we get desperate, that'll make us persistent. Amen? That'll make us persistent when we get determined and we get desperate. I want you to look with me. In verse 27, or the latter part of verse 26, the Bible said, and she besought Him, or she just simply begged and begged, kept begging, kept asking that He would cast forth the devil out of her daughter. But Jesus said unto her, let the children first be filled, for it is not meet to take the children's bread and to cast it unto the dogs. And she answered and said unto Him, yes, Lord, yet the dogs under the table eat of the children's crumbs. Now I want to be perfectly honest and transparent with you tonight. I had a hard time with that verse for a long time. I did. And I thought to myself, I said, now God, I know that that's just not your nature. And I know you wasn't being mean to that woman, but what in this world did you mean by what you said when you called her a little dog? Well, here's what I believe it was. And I believe I have the Lord's approval on this. You see, this woman had come to the point, she was so desperate that she was willing to listen to anything Jesus had to say to her. She was willing to hear whatever it was that he had to tell her. She wanted to hear it. And what did he do? He exposed her spiritual deficiency when he called her a little dog. Folks, I want to share something with you about prayer that you may or may not have known. But a lot of times before God will deal with a certain situation outside of you, He will deal with a situation that is within you. And He exposed this woman's spiritual deficiency when He called her a little dog. Now let me explain. I told you earlier that Jews, they had no dealings with Greeks. They couldn't stand them. They despised them. If you want to get technical, they just simply hated them. And their terminology for those Greeks were dogs. They called them ravening beasts. That was their definition for those Greeks. They couldn't stand them and they didn't want them. So therefore they just called them dogs, signifying who they were. Signifying that they were a people that were outside of the covenant promise of God. They were out of the commonwealth of Israel. They did not serve nor worship the Lord Jehovah God, the one true God. And when Jesus called her a little dog, He showed her right there who she was and what she was. That she was someone that was outside the covenant promise of God. That she was someone that had been engaged and been involved in pagan worship. And what she needed was to turn completely to Him. He exposed who she was. You know, she acknowledged her sin. She acknowledged that He was in fact right. I want you to look with me. There in verse 28, the Bible said, "And she answered and said unto Him, Yes, Lord." You see, she had an absence of pride. She said, "You're right. That's who I am." She knew she was a sinner. She confessed it right there when she said, "Yes, Lord." She knew she was a sinner, and she knew that she was unworthy to receive anything from God. Folks, I'm going to be honest with you. Maybe there's some things in our life, if our prayers are not prevailing, if we're not seeing the hand of God move in our prayer life, there's probably something wrong inside of us. Let me share with you what the psalmist said in Psalm 66, verse 18. It said, "If I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear." Many times when our prayers are not answered, it's because of sin. That is the only thing, according to Scripture, that causes God not to hear, is sin. He exposed her deficiency. I want to ask you a question tonight. How is your prayer life? Do you see God moving in your prayers? Do you see God answering your prayers? And if not, why? Why? You know, folks, she got desperate. She got so desperate to hear from Him. She was willing to meet any requirement that He had. What do you need to agree about with God tonight? When's the last time that you got so desperate and you got so determined to receive? When's the last time you got desperate to see somebody saved? When's the last time you got desperate to see that lost loved one, that family member saved?